All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the webinar, Final Updates to Soil Relocation in British Columbia, presented by Travis Deeter. Now, Travis has over 20 years experience working in contaminated sites, including residential, commercial, and industrial sites within BC, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. He has been involved in large infrastructure projects, chemical spill cleanups, large-scale developments, environmental monitoring programs, and numerous transactional due diligence investigations, many of which have resulted in obtaining Ministry of Environment regulatory instruments. Travis has successfully assisted his client in relocating large volumes of soil during improvement and development projects. He is also a numerical standard specialist with the Society of Contaminated Sites Approved Professionals of BC. And today's webinar is hosted by PhilConnect, the dirt exchange platform. Now, if you haven't used PhilConnect before, PhilConnect allows companies to save time, money, and the environment by collaborating with nearby project sites that need fill or have fill. So some of the common features are the map, where you can locate nearby project sites, so you can save on trucking fees as well and save the environment. Rather than driving for hours, you can drive for a few minutes or an hour, and you can see all the nearby project sites. You can also filter by location, by quantity, by type of fill, so that you can find the right material right away. And most of all, you can upload and download documents. And this is going to be very critical, especially as more transparency is needed right now. And a recent project was in UBC, where two projects were able to collaborate. They were only 5 minutes away from each other. So one project had excess fill, and they were able to take it to another project with quick testing. Now, this is something that would have probably taken much longer, and trucks would have had to drive much longer. So that's why we're here to help people collaborate with the PhilConnect platform. And this webinar is also hosted by Magnas Media. I'm the founder of Magnas Media, and we provide branding, a corporate website, and presentation. So we did help with the PhilConnect website, and we also help a lot of clients with any presentations, proposals, budget approval. So if you have anything, we can help you with that. And on the call here today, we also have with us Mana Arabi, CEO and co-founder of PhilConnect. Now, Mana is a civil engineer with over 20 years of experience. Mana has worked on many private and public projects in Canada and the United States for prominent companies such as Dragado, SNC-Lavalin, Norland, Lafarge, Eurovia, and North Construction, as well as myself, Hwayda Kater, and I will be your moderator here today. Now, before we continue, I'm sure you have a lot of questions, so we're going to open up the Q&A towards the end of the webinar. We'll allow Travis to give us the full presentation first with the critical updates. And please do keep your microphone on mute, because we are recording this webinar, and it'll be available as well for others who are not able to join us here today. So Travis, please go ahead, and I'll pass over the presentation to you.
Okay, thanks, Hwayda. Hello, everyone. So we are here to, I know the cover page said final update. I'm not sure that's going to be true. We'll see. But we're going to go over what we know now, and everything is in effect as of today. So we're going to look at what that final soil relocation process looks like. The new Protocol 19. So this is what we were missing, the actual nuts and bolts of how we assess sites for soil relocation. We'll do a recap of high volume receiving sites. Nothing's really changed on that front. And then we'll go over some of the challenges that I see now that we have the full picture going, and then wrap up with a Q&A session. So the notification, nothing has changed here. If you've been with us before, you have to have a Schedule 2 commercial or industrial use as listed on the Contaminated Sites Regulation. And it is an and, not an or, you have to be moving 30 or more cubic meters of soil. So if you're moving less than 30 cubic meters of soil, even if it comes from a Schedule 2 use, you don't have to go through this notification process. That is an exemption that was put in mainly to help municipalities with like roadside work that needs to be conducted on an emergency basis, even, so that they wouldn't have to go through the 1 week waiting period. So let's just look at that notification process one more time. Oh, here's just a little quick reminder. This is what Schedule 2 looks like. So it's available on the ministry website if you are wondering if you have a Schedule 2 use on your site. Final process. So we still require 1 week notification before you move that soil. Okay, so there's still a potential for some delays to happen here if you don't have all of your ducks in a row and your paperwork in order. What are the exemptions? So we just talked about the 30 cubic meter one. If your receiving site is outside BC, or if it's on federal property other than a reserve, First Nation reserves are included in this regulation. However, something like ocean dumping is not included. If you're sending your soil straight from a site to the ocean dumping through one of the permits, you don't have to go through this notification process. If your soil came from a gravel quarry or similar site with a permit under the Mines Act, or your low impact land use basically means a residential use, which would be unlikely to have a Schedule 2 anyways. That's an exemption. Preload material, if you're just moving that around for preload purposes, it's exempt. And if you're using winter maintenance sand, that would also be exempt for having to file a notification. So as we've seen before, we've gone over that form. We know it requires a lot of information. You have to have full owner's information, land titles for both source and receiving sites. I think that's going to be a tricky one for some people is getting used to getting that information from your receiving site, when really it's the receiving sites have been used to collecting all the information from soil they're receiving. And you have to have information like, where is that soil going on that receiving site? Provide a map, show where it's going to be placed on that site. What's the future use of that receiving site? You have to put something down for that. What are the applicable standards at that receiving site? So a lot of information is going to need to be gathered up in order to file these notifications. So, the bottom line is don't delay, get on that early. It has to be signed by a qualified professional. So that is someone who's regulated under a professional organization in BC. The online form is live. It is up there. This is all live as of today. You are having to file these notifications if you're moving pertinent soil. You do need a BC EID to file a notification. It's a very simple process. I did it this morning just to see how long it would take, how quick it would be, and it was done within 5 minutes. So not a tough process to get that ID. So that's all I've got for notification, because there really isn't much new to talk about there. What there is a lot new to talk about, which is what we're going to spend the bulk of the time talking about, is the level of assessment that's needed on these sites. So what level is it, who can do it, and when should you do it? We've got protocol 19. So this is different than the technical guidance documents that we work with for contaminated soil. Technical guidance is just that, it's guidance. Here's how we'd like you to do it, but we understand you might have certain scenarios on your site that means you have to deviate from this. Protocols are different. They are regulated under the CSR, and therefore, if you are deviating from that, you have to have permission, technically, to deviate from that protocol. So we're quite restricted in how we have to do these assessments. It also means that when there's not clarity in the protocol, that creates issues for us, because we're reluctant to go outside those borders when it is in a protocol. So we'll just have to see how some of this plays out in real time. So it does provide the criteria which QPs are going to investigate uncontaminated soil. Again, this is all for uncontaminated soil. If you've got contaminated soil, different process, none of this applies. However, that protocol is going to be updated at some point to include all the investigation we currently do for contaminated sites. Now, I'm looking at that as an opportunity that maybe they can revise some of the soil relocation that's in a protocol. Protocol's a bit bigger deal to try and revise for the ministry because it is such a regulated process. So it will be updated. I'm hoping some of these issues, conflicts that we're going to talk through here could get fixed during one of those updates. So the very first step in this protocol is that the qualified professional has to prepare a sampling and analysis plan. So it's pretty vague as to what form that takes, but there does have to be a plan. You have to identify areas of excavation. Where do you have site buildings? What are the areas of potential environmental concern, or APEX, that have been identified? What are your potential contaminants on that site? So bottom line is you have to do a historical review. Most times that's going to take the form of a phase 1 environmental site assessment. That's going to tell you everything you need to know to conduct this assessment. So the boreholes, we're going to talk through the drilling investigation part here first. So you can have them spaced up to 50 meters apart, 25 to 50 meters, with minimum spacing required as you're actually close to where those apex are. So if you got a gas station on your site, you need to be at the tighter end of that distance when you're in and around the gas station. As you move away from that, sure, you can spread them out a bit more. Samples have to be collected at specific depths. So where do they want them? They want it 0.5 meters within surface. Probably the reason there is because they're targeting fill material. That's typically where you'd find that. Immediately above fine-grained surface or stratigraphy. So what they're worried about there is contaminants that are moving down through the ground, through the water table. They are going to collect where you find those interfaces of sands with a clay, right? That tight clay, that's going to stop contaminants. So the ministry says that's where you need to look for it. So some good rationale there. At the water table elevation, again, that's where some types of contaminants will collect, particularly hydrocarbons. So again, required to assess there. Otherwise, you're looking at every 1 to 2 meters vertically through your excavation depth. So, I've got the little graphic there. It's actually for a water well, but it was surprisingly difficult to find a good graphic for just a borehole. But that's basically what they're looking at. So you are going to be sampling as you go down through these holes and at about this level of frequency. Now, if you're stockpile sampling, your soil samples have to be obtained from different depths. It's not really too well stated in there. Maybe it's just not required. Minimum of 0.3 meters below the pile surface. But the bottom line is you do have to dig into that pile to get those samples. So just having a shovel on the outside, probably not going to be viewed as sufficient. You're going to need to have a machine out there for any kind of sizable pile. Now, as far as what are we testing for? So this is one of the big areas that's going to be for discussion, I think. So the minimum is pretty simple. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, just a common type of hydrocarbon, and then a prescribed list of metals, which features most of the ones that you'd expect: arsenic, lead, cadmium, copper, all those guys are on there. The third one is a little bit less clear, and I've just referenced the exact wording from Protocol 19. Any potential contaminant of concern, so PCOCs, relevant to current and historical use as noted during historical review. So when consultants do these phase ones and we identify a concern, we come up with a table at the end, and typically it's, APEC 1, it's a gas station, what are my PCOCs? And then you'd go through and list every type of chemical that could have been used as part of that service station or that land use, whatever it is. So those would be what you're investigating for in a normal contaminated sites investigation. Now, having this here presents some problems because it's saying each sample, and as you're going to see as we go through some case studies here, that could be quite a few samples. And some types of use, you look at auto repair as the number one, where you're dealing with hydrocarbons and solvents and metals and glycols. That's a lot of different parameters. And if you're sampling if you're testing every single sample for all of those parameters, your lab costs are going through the roof. So it's a little bit unclear if that's what the ministry intended, if they really wanted 300 samples tested for dry cleaners when a dry cleaner unit's only 1% of the site. Hopefully that's where we'll get some clarity in the coming weeks and months here, and maybe we can try and keep those costs down as far as we can anyways. One bright spot, salt is not on that list. So fill sites, take notice, the Ministry of Environment does not consider salt to be a minimum parameter for sampling. So maybe we can get some relief on that side of things as part of this. What's the sampling frequency? Nothing's really changed here. This is the same table that was presented in the final policy direction paper last year. I've just reused it because it's easier to look at than the language that's in Protocol 19. One slight change from that policy paper is that now instead of only needing one minimum sample for in-ground sampling, they want a minimum of 3. So not unreasonable there. So when and how are we going to complete this? It's definitely the most advantageous to complete these assessments while the soil is still in the ground or in situ, especially for larger excavations. So just gone through a bit of a math exercise there. Let's look at a 10,000 cubic meter excavation. So that's going to need 50 samples if we take those samples while the soil is still in the ground. And if you wait, dig that out, stockpile it somewhere, you're going to need 59 samples. And then that differential just grows as the excavation gets larger. So there's no doubt it's definitely better to have it done in the ground. Also can identify any potential issues before you actually start work on the site. So it gives you a bit more time to do some planning. And then stockpile sampling in general can introduce some challenges as far as soil vapor sampling goes. And we'll get into that a little bit next. So soil vapor, I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but it is something people should be aware of. So if your consultant is saying, well, we have to do vapor sampling now, these are some of the reasons why. So again, the concern with vapor is volatile contaminants in the ground. They volatilize into a gaseous form. That gas moves up and can infiltrate into buildings and cause issues for people and occupants of those buildings. Now, you don't have to do this every time. And so the ministry has tried to be helpful here as much as possible in removing the automatic requirement to do vapor sampling. So now your vapor sampling is all about what is your soil data saying? Now, if you're sampling for a dry cleaner at your site, like we saw before, you're doing those 300 samples for VOCs. All you need is one detection out of those 300 samples, and now you're going to be going back and doing vapor sampling. And that vapor sampling has to be the raw data you collect from the ground. So again, vapor, the concern is it's coming out of the ground and into your breathing zone, but we're measuring it while it's in the ground. So we're getting higher concentrations in the ground than are going to be in the breathing space that we're actually taking into our lungs. In the real world, we're allowed to use vapor attenuation factors, which are just small numbers basically to reduce the concentration. You get a very basic one is a 50-fold reduction just by having a slab on the ground. So you test it in the ground, your benzene concentration is 50. I can then reduce that, and now it's 1 in the breathing zone, and that's what I compare to my standard. Under soil relocation, that's not allowed. The rationale is the ministry doesn't know where the soil is going, doesn't know what it's going to be used for, doesn't know where it's going to be placed. And therefore, you can't accurately say, well, there would definitely be a slab there. I think there's some debate there, but the bottom line is we're not allowed to use them. So if you do sample for vapor, there's a good chance you're going to find some raw hits in the ground. And right now it is totally unclear what to do about those raw hits. Are you trying to delineate them? You try and do that, you're probably going to find more of it. We've seen numerous examples of raw failures just based on drill rig contributions alone. Now, those should theoretically clear up over time, but it's just another complication that you really don't want. So the bottom line is vapor sampling will require careful consideration. If your consultant's saying we got to do vapor sampling, make sure you get a good reason why. There are some reasons, there are some areas here we can't work around, but it's definitely something you want to consider before going ahead and sampling. Just another complication is stockpiles. So the ministry has said that under certain circumstances, you will have to vapor sample via stockpile. That stockpile has to be left in place for a minimum of 1 week prior to sampling. I imagine that would cause problems for a lot of construction sites. Also, sites with shallow water tables will need to complete this type of vapor sampling because, of course, you can't put a vapor probe in where the soil is totally saturated. So now let's go through and look at some cost examples, some real world, well, theoretical real world scenarios here. So some of you might have seen this example before. It's been fine-tuned now that we have the full Protocol 19 information. So it's a large shopping center development, 5-level underground parkade. We're going to call it 500,000 cubic meters requiring soil samples. So if we go back to that frequency table we looked at before, I have to analyze samples for each level there. So it's not, oh, I'm doing a 500,000. I only have to comply with the 40,000 cubic meter frequency. No, it's every time. The first 10,000 are to this, the next 10 to 40,000 are this, and then anything over 40,000 is this. So that's where we get our 50, 67, and 230 samples. Total of 347 samples needed for that one. So our excavation depth is 15 meters. It is advantageous to take your samples as close as you can together. I'd say there's some gray area as to just how close you're allowed to take them, because of course, if you take them all from one borehole, that does save you money, but it raises the question, have you actually assessed the soil on your site or just the soil in that 6-inch diameter hole that came out of the ground? So anyways, the ministry puts in there every 1 to 2 meters. So I've gone with the minimum there. Let's say we're going to analyze every 1 meter. So each borehole is going to need 16 to 17 samples. Some of this depends on how many fine grain layers do you have. Do you have a perched water table and a regional water table? So again, some differences with different sites, but this program is going to need about 20 boreholes. So if we look at those costs, just some rough numbers here, we end up with about $125,000 for that assessment. That is for the bare minimum testing of PAHs and metals. If you need sonic drilling because you're in, on the North Shore and there's lots of gravel and stuff, then you're going to need another $30,000 for that. Now, if that mall had a dry cleaner on it and you need to test 347 samples for VOCs, that's another $30,000 in lab fees you can tack onto that. And then what happens if you get random hits of metals, which are guaranteed going to happen at a lot of sites, or if you have volatile detections. So you can see there's still some uncertainty, even though we have this protocol now to work from. Number 2 examples, much smaller excavation. So we're just going to say a small retail center redevelopment. We're going to put in a 1-level parkade on this site. Our site area. So these 2 next examples look at actually the same size excavation, but the site design has changed. It's different area, and there are some differences there. So anyways, this one, 3,300 square meters, 10,000 cubic meters coming out. We know we need 50 samples. So based on our excavation depth of just 1 story or 3 meters, that means we're going to need 12 boreholes because we can only take so many samples out of each borehole. Here's your cost there, $28,000, okay? Now, if we go to the next one, basically the same volume, same number of samples, 10,000 cubic meters, 50 samples, but our site's much smaller. It's only 1,700 square meters. So this site's going to put in a 2-level parkade to make it economically feasible for the redevelopment. So we actually have a smaller program here with 7 boreholes. And because we can go deeper in each one of those boreholes, we're actually saving some money here. So the previous one, 28,000. This one's come down by almost 20% to 23,000. So I thought that was interesting and didn't really realize it until we started working through these examples. Now I'm going to take this example and change it slightly. So you'll see at the top there, this is a former welding use site. So I've specified that to say, well, here's an example of a Schedule 2 use site, the PCOC at a welding site. Typically metals, you could argue maybe there's some solvent use, but for simplicity's sake here, let's say we would only worry about metals. So there's no additional analysis required for this one. Now that exact same site, everything about it's the same, but now instead of welding, we've got former auto repair and a gas station. Okay, so now we're sampling, all 50 samples. We're going to need a full hydrocarbon scan, full VOC scan, metals already, of course, as well as glycols in there. So we're adding a lot of parameters, and every single one of those samples has to be tested. Well, you can see the impact on our lab fees. They've almost tripled, and it's basically more than doubled the cost of that investigation. So this is an area where we are going to be hoping to get some clarity from the ministry on, because it does have a very large impact on the cost of these assessments. So we'll go into high volume receiving sites. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I don't think it's going to apply to too many sites, frankly. So just a quick standards review. High volume receiving sites are all about what quality of soil are you trying to ship, and then does it have to go to a high volume receiving site, or I should say, does that fill site need to have a high volume designation? So here's our general. We have hazardous waste at the top, the worst, and then wildlands quality at the bottom being the best. The ones that I'd like you to pay attention to are the residential in the middle there. So we have high density, low density, and then commercial quality. So what happened here after a revision, which is very helpful really for the industry, is the ministry said, okay, your trigger to be a high volume receiving site is 20,000 cubic meters coming from Schedule 2 sites. So initially we were like, well, that's not a lot of soil, and that's going to fill up sites really quickly before they have to become a high volume receiving site, which is a decent amount of effort to get that designation. So that was a concern. The ministry listened and they said, okay, well, it's actually only going to apply to soil that exceeds high density residential standards. Okay. So it's only the stuff that's in between commercial quality and that high density residential standard that would have to go to a high volume receiving site, or that could go to a high volume receiving site. So that really what that did was it reduced the number of sites that are actually going to need to worry about this type of a fill site to send their material to. If you do need to become a high volume receiving site, as I said, it's a pretty decent amount of effort involved. You have to have soil management plan, has to be developed by a qualified professional and has to be approved by an approved professional. Can't be the same person. It's going to involve a whole bunch of documentation, soil tracking. You have to install monitoring well networks on your site and do seasonal groundwater monitoring, closure plan. So I don't think a lot of sites are going to go through this. But again, I don't think it's a huge issue, and that's because of how soil standards work in BC. So this has been this term coin of Goldilocks soil. It's not because it's great soil, it's because it's kind of rare soil. It has to be just right in order to fit into that category. So in BC, drinking water is typically the factor that drives you either as clean or dirty. So here's looking at this matrix table for arsenic. So the arsenic standard doesn't really matter what your land use is, it's going to be 10. So in this case, you're either clean or you're dirty. There's no in between for this high density. So if your problem is an arsenic problem at a site, you're not considering a high volume receiving site anyways. And that goes for a lot of the different types of metals that we typically see there. So there's no change from high density residential to commercial use for everything in red there. There are for some of the ones on the right-hand side. So this is really only going to come into play if maybe you have a lead concentration that exceeds your high density standards, but it's below commercial use. You could then send it to a high volume receiving site. But again, that's assuming there's one in your area that makes sense, and it may actually just make more sense to send it to a landfill or a treatment facility, because those are going to be more available than high volume receiving sites, I believe. So if you have more questions about high volume receiving sites, please reach out to me, because they are a whole kind of separate animal here. But again, I just don't see them becoming that big a factor. So here we are to talk about anticipated challenges that we've got with all of this. So there is still uncertainty associated with Protocol 19. As I kind of said here, what happens? Do we have to test all of these samples for all of those? Can we tighten up the amount of samples taken from a single borehole? So there's still, and of course, the vapor sampling considerations are still there. So we're hoping for clarity. We haven't actually had a chance to have the discussion with the ministry. It was kind of released in final form, and we've just all been digesting it the past few weeks. And again, hoping for that chance to have a discussion with the ministry soon about it and clarify some of these questions. Still potential for significant delay costs if your fill sites are not available and you need to submit a new notification. So I had said this previously, there are multiple spots on the notification form. You can have up to 3 fill sites selected when you file your notification. So again, you do want to have a backup, because you would have to file a new notification if you have to switch fill sites, and that means a new 1-week waiting period where you can't move any soil off of your site. So I think it's going to become pretty common to have multiple fill sites as your go-to. Driller availability could become an issue. This is a brand new assessment protocol. No one has really been doing this before. Maybe a bit of stockpile sampling here and there, but now people like me are going to be telling their clients, do this assessment while the soil's still in the ground. That means you're going to need drill rigs. It's unlikely excavators are going to be that helpful for anything beyond a 1-story parkade. So I expect drill availability to go down. So certainly something you want to keep an eye on, and don't delay in trying to get these assessments started. What do we do if we identify naturally occurring variability? Just, arsenic of 10. What happens if we have 12? It happens all the time right now. And in a lot of cases, we use statistical arguments to say that's all this is. It's just natural variability in the ground. And usually that's successful. What is missing from this protocol is any kind of language saying that that's an acceptable use to get rid of naturally occurring contamination, or naturally occurring variability, I should say. It's not contamination, it's naturally occurring. So I would also hope that the ministry could try and provide some comfort to fill sites on that, because what I have personally seen, and I know others have seen in the past, is that fill sites are reluctant to accept statistical arguments. And when we're submitting 347 samples, all for metals, if even 1% of those comes back, that's going to be tough to try and go back and get that, let alone 5 or 10% of those and all over your site at different depths. It could be a nightmare. So hopefully we get a bit of relief on that front at some point. Soil vapor, it's really unclear whether it becomes a significant issue. I think the big question marks for the ministry here are going to be, how much does historical data come into play? A lot of these sites have already had investigations done. They've already got vapor data. So what happens if a vapor sample 5 years ago shows a raw exceedance? Do we have to live by that? Do we have to go back, install a new vapor probe and resample it and hope that we get clean results? We don't know right now. So, vapor could become much ado about nothing, or it could become a severely limiting factor in moving soil. And it just kind of depends on how this plays out in real life. Fill sites requiring protocol 19 level assessments unnecessarily. So by that, I mean, you're not a Schedule 2 use. You're not filing a notification. You shouldn't be in the system at all. And you're not technically in the system, but a fill site saying, well, we want you to do that assessment anyways. That could become a problem. And frankly, we have already seen a fill site that one of our clients uses regularly sent out a brand new form yesterday with P19 information on it. Now, they don't specifically say they need P19 for everything, but they have increased their standard frequency to match P19 pretty closely. So it was interesting to see that already, and I'm a little concerned that other fill sites might follow, and that's just going to drive up the cost of moving soil, any soil, whether it should be in this system or not. What happens if there are buildings on site? So again, another part of P19 talks about this spacing. Well, that's fine if you've got a big open site and you can just plop your boreholes wherever you want. But what if you've got a huge shopping center mall on there? What if you don't have the spacing necessary to conduct that grid? A little unclear right now as to how that would go. So that's the formal presentation I've got here. Now, we discussed going through and looking at the ministry website. I think it would probably be helpful for people to know where to find this information. So I'm just going to quickly stop sharing the PowerPoint, and we're going to go to the ministry's website real quick here. I think that's up now. So this is the homepage for site remediation. So if you do want to access the site information, or the soil relocation information system, or file a notification, this is going to be your starting point. Of course, you'll bookmark the proper one, but I just thought we'd go from here. So to start, you go with remediation implementation. Left-hand side, we've got soil relocation right there. And so this is the page that you'd want to bookmark going forward to just come back here and be able to see this every time. So it provides some general information, links to different CSR standards and protocols. And then we've got the notification requirements here. So we click on here. This is if you did need to file a notification. Again, you have to be a qualified professional to do that. What it's going to, I think, do, so it's going to kick you in here. So you need to create a BCEID, as I mentioned, in order to access this form, but it's not too hard to do that. So I've already done that. And we can see it works just fine. Yeah. So here it is. So this is the online notification form. And so you're just going to go through this and fill it all out. So I'm not going to do this because it's the exact same form I've shown before. But again, source site information, project details, what's the standards that it meets, how much more are you moving, what's your characterization methods, and then you can add different sites in here. So a little more functional than the paper version. And at the end of the day, someone like me has to go in here, fill it out, and click submit, and include all the information, and that gets sent to the ministry. The other area I wanted to show was this. So soil relocation information system. This is the new database, the web map that will be available for, I think most parties, as long probably you'll need a BCEID. It's a little unclear. As it says, the database will be launched soon. So hopefully that is sooner than later that we can take a look at that. And now we'll just go back to the presentation here. Okay. So that's the end. That's what I got. Clear as mud.
Thank you so much, Travis. So for questions, you can have your question in the chat. I have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask Travis and take this opportunity. And then we'll go to your questions. One thing I wanted to add is that just to clarify that all these changes are only for Schedule 2 use sites. So for all the other sites, the greenfield, residential, and contaminated, nothing has changed.
Correct.
So you can still use PhilConnect and try to connect with other sites to save time and money and the environment. But one question I had, Travis, was that recently I was looking at a project that was in downtown Vancouver. The soil reports, the environmental soil report that I read, looked like the site was clean, but all around it, it mentioned in the report that had Schedule 2 use. There was a gas station, there was a dry cleaner, and mechanic shop. So in that case, what would we do as a contractor that needs to try to find a place to take the material?
Right. So, I mean, assuming the material's been tested, it probably would be tested anyways because you have all these concerns around the site. That probably would have been done at an earlier investigation phase, I think. Yeah. But if that site itself that's being redeveloped does not have a Schedule 2 use, then it doesn't matter what's around it. That dig would not have to go through this notification system.
Okay. That's great. Yeah, that was the question. So I'm just going to go through some of the questions here. Mm-hmm. One question is, can Travis speak about how to avoid the notification process? I.e., what exemptions are there? Are facilities on First Nation land exempt? This is actually a really good question because a lot of people think that the First Nation land is exempt, but I'll let you go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, really the only exemptions are those ones I discussed at the start. So you're either less than 30 cubic meters you're moving, or you're moving soil to a federal property other than a First Nations reserve. So First Nations are included in this. The landfills, the fill sites that have been set up on First Nation reserves, they are going to be subject to this regulation. So federal properties that wouldn't be, as I said, ocean dumping, that process is regulated by Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So that one, not included. If you were maybe sending soil to another federally regulated property like a port, the airport, the soil going there would not have to go through this notification. So those are really the only exemptions there, other than, as I also said, preload material, winter maintenance sand. But I think this question is trying to think about how do we move soil that we want to move without triggering this, and it's been made pretty tight that you can't. And specifically, I know they included First Nations on purpose to try and avoid just driving a whole bunch of soil to reserve lands.
And one question was if it's for all sites or Schedule 2, but it's only for Schedule 2. Nothing has changed for greenfield or contaminated. The other question is, the website states that we need to clarify that the soil is not waste soil. What is their definition of waste soil?
So waste would mean the same as contaminated. So in this case, waste would be anything exceeding commercial industrial standards. So there's no site that you can just take that to. That would have to go to a licensed treatment facility. That's what the term waste means. So they're basically saying you need to do this testing already to ensure that your soil is not contaminated, because if it's contaminated, it's not in this system and it has to be disposed of properly.
Which makes it, if the soil is not contaminated, then it's not waste and it can be reused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi, Travis. Can you talk about the new requirements for ML-ARD assessment in Protocol 19?
Yeah, so this is basically looking at types of rock and gravel that can be leachable for various types of metals, especially arsenic. And so this is getting pretty detailed. Thanks, Paul, for throwing that out there. But really what this comes up with is, because in the initial policy paper, there was a lot of concern from things like gravel quarries and gravel pits because a lot of them are Schedule II uses. They have fueling stations on them. They do repairs for their trucks and stuff. So there are Schedule II uses within this gravel quarry. But of course, that would mean that every single load of material that's coming out of those pits would have to be sampled for, according to Protocol 19, and notifications would have to be, and it would basically, shut down the quarry shipping industry, really, or significantly slow it down. So that was recognized that was just not workable. And so that was another one of those exemptions I mentioned before, where if you have a Mines Act permit, which my understanding is most of these gravel pits do, then you are exempt from this. And so the ministry did that to make sure that, we didn't shut down the mining of local quarried material. And then Protocol 19, the very end of it, presents this section discussing testing for ML-ARD. Frankly, I don't have a really good answer for this, because it kind of came out of nowhere. It really wasn't expected to be in this protocol, because the ministry had already given exemption for material coming out of this. And now all of a sudden, they've basically put in this requirement to do testing at gravel pits for types of leachate. It's unclear whether this actually falls into the notification, the soil relocation process, or if this is something that is just an additional requirement that all gravel quarries and pits are expected to do. I think this is, again, one of those items that we're going to need to get clarity from the Ministry of Environment on what was the intention here, because it's actually a bit of a conflict. The regulation says that there's an exemption for pits that have the Mines Act permit, and yet we've got this protocol that says you have to be doing this type of sampling for pits. So it's an unknown. I wish I had a better answer for you, but right now it's something that needs to be clarified.
Okay, thank you. One question is if qualified professionals, yes, I think you mentioned that only qualified professionals are able to file the notification. So I just want to confirm that. Where roadways would fall under the Schedule 2?
Yeah, so roadways are not a Schedule 2 activity. So that's a good thing for sure.
Yeah.
So municipalities doing their utility replacements, roadworks improvements, and they're having to get rid of that soil. None of that should be falling under this system. It shouldn't be captured. But again, like I mentioned before, we've seen this updated fill site requirement that was specifically for soil coming from roadworks. That was a municipal client who received that thing. So even though they're maybe not having to go through the notification process, it looks like they could end up getting caught up in the actual analysis and sampling process, unfortunately. But we'll just have to see how that plays out.
Mm-hmm. For the borehole testing on a site, who would be responsible for this? The excavator contractor, the general contractor, or developer?
I mean, it's really about how is a contract set up. This is going to have to be something that's taken into consideration in tendering agreements and contracts now. Who does this work? Like I said before, it's more advantageous to do this while the soil is still in the ground. So is your general contractor, your excavator contractor involved at that point? I'm not sure. That's probably a developer specific question, but I can tell you from the conversations I'm having, it's typically the site owners. So whether that's a municipality, whether that's a developer, that's who is going to have to start this process. That's not regulated, by anyone can technically do it. But I think, practically speaking, it's going to be the site owner that commissions this work, whether they do that through a project manager or directly with the consultant. And the bottom line is it has to be done in order to file the notification, and no one can move soil off that site until the notification is filed. So it may be a shared, responsibility at the end of the day.
I think I see that falling under contractor, because they're the one who would actually move the soil, and they would need to, like the owner doesn't know where the contractor is going to take the material, because with this notification you need to know where it's going. I think it's gonna fall under the contractor who's gonna bear this, the cost. I'm not sure. Maybe that's something that could be charged back to the owner, but I'll see that being mostly the contractor.
Yeah, it gets complicated because I'm not sure the contractor, well, it does depend, because the sampling analysis plan has to take into the redevelopment of the site, because of course you're only going to do testing where you're doing excavation works. And so that would be determined pretty early on, as the developer would know what they want to build on the site, and could probably save themselves some money by hiring the consultant directly rather than going through their contractor and paying a markup or something, and having the assessment work done itself. Now, the notification, you're right, that's going to take more contractor input, because they know where they're taking the soil and they'll have to get that. So again, maybe it comes back to being a shared agreement. Maybe the developer does the assessment and the contractor handles the notification, with a consultant having to be involved in both areas anyways. So
So is Ministry of Environment permitted facilities are also exempt?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that means referring to a licensed waste treatment facility. And so yes, because you're not sending it to a receiving site, you're sending it to a licensed treatment facility. Ordinarily you wouldn't send clean soil to one of those places, but there's nothing saying you can't send it there.
Okay. Under Schedule 2 land use, is commercial land included? Examples: shopping malls, office buildings, restaurants, etc.
So that really goes back to specific uses on that site. So shopping mall is a great example. Dry cleaners, lots of shopping malls have dry cleaners. Now you've got a Schedule 2 use on your site. That Schedule 2 use is not limited to the footprint of the dry cleaner. It is your entire site. Now, how do you define site? It's typically based on legal parcels. So a lot of shopping centers are just one large, big legal parcel. That means that whole parcel is going to have to get assessed under the current regulation, even though your dry cleaner was 2% of your site. So again, it depends. Some shopping malls might get captured in this, others may not if they never had any kind of Schedule 2 use on it.
Okay. The next question, I think, so they're saying that they're moving 20,000 cubic meter of soil from one industrial site, petroleum product, to another industrial site, petroleum product. Can you confirm that Protocol 19 would apply? Which I don't think, because that's contaminated. Right?
Well, see, they're not really saying that it's contaminated, though. They're just saying that it's being moved from a site which does some type of petroleum use, maybe it's a bulk plant, to another site that has petroleum use. So in this case, the first answer is yes, Protocol 19 applies because you've got a Schedule 2 use on your site. The second question is all about the quality of that soil. So that goes back to what I was saying about high volume receiving sites. Now, hydrocarbons are actually the one type of parameter where there are several typical parameters that have differences between those high density standards and the commercial standards. So if your soil, it's been tested according to Protocol 19, and if you come out with seeing some of those concentrations that fit that Goldilocks definition, then that is correct. You could not move it to your other site more than 20,000 without it being registered as a high volume receiving site. But if your soil meets high density residential or better, then no, that other site does not have to be a high volume receiving site, and you could go ahead and move your soil over there with the proper notification being filed. So yeah, good question.
Yeah. So the next question, if there is one property site where Schedule 2 use occurs on part of the site and the other part is considered parkland recreational, would this Schedule 2 require notification?
Yeah, right now you don't have any way out of that. You can't just arbitrarily say, well, this side's been used for this and this side's been used for that. That's the same shopping mall argument. Well, this area has only ever been parking. It's not the dry cleaner. Ministry doesn't care right now. You're doing it all everywhere. So in this case, though, if you had, if there was a legal parcel definition there, and one side had just had the residence or an apartment building, and the other side, I think you could draw that line down and say, well, this parcel never had a Schedule 2 use, so it's out of the regulation, and this one would have to be considered within it. So it's going to have to be a site-specific discussion.
Okay. How would this apply if moving soil from a pipeline right-of-way to a licensed facility or storage and then back to the right-of-way? So I guess that's also a good question for transfer stations in general.
Yeah, no exemptions. So if that transfer station is considered, if it's like a municipal waste, type transfer station, that's a Schedule 2 use. Once it goes onto that property, it would be required to have a notification filed. Maybe your sampling's already done, maybe you've got that, but it would have to sit there for a week while the notification played out, and then it could be moved somewhere else afterwards. So yeah, pipeline, pipelines are Schedule 2 uses. So here you get into a bit of an interesting area between federal and provincial regulation. If you're a federally permitted project, pipeline, maybe this doesn't apply to you, moving that out. However, if you're moving it onto provincial property out of that pipeline, now you are having to file this. But maybe if it's going straight from the pipeline to ocean dumping, you could get out of that. So that one's a bit more of an interesting one. As far as a licensed facility, I don't know exactly what that means. If it's like a waste treatment facility, typically it's not going there and then coming back. It's going there because it's a waste product. And as I said, a transfer station, there's no such thing as a temporary storage facility as far as the Ministry of Environment is concerned. So it's most likely you're going to get caught up in that scenario if it's going on to provincial land and then having to send it back to a right-of-way.
Mm-hmm. Do the ML/ARD assessment in Protocol 19 apply to bedrock being blasted and removed from a site?
Possibly. This is where this thing came out of nowhere and nobody really knows what it's meant to capture. Is it just looking at, is it anywhere that has bedrock and you're doing blasting? Or is it just at pits and mines kind of thing? My gut tells me it's more just the pits and mines. When it has to be done is still a gray area. But I think if you're at a site and you're just doing some blasting and bedrock and you didn't have a Schedule 2 use on your property, then I don't see why you would immediately have to go and do this type of testing. Reality is a lot of fill sites would ask for that though. If you're shipping them bedrock, they might want to know if it's leachable already. So you may have to do some level of testing to start.
Okay. So to clarify, we only have to submit a movement notification if we are moving or disposing of soil coming from a piece of land designated under CL or IL land use, or if we're moving soil which exceeds CL, IL contamination.
So yes and no. This one, so it's CL or IL, a specified Schedule 2 land use. So it's not every commercial or every industrial activity. It has to be on that Schedule 2 of the CSR to trip you into this system. And then if you're moving soil which exceeds CL, IL, that's waste. It's not part of this. It can only go one spot, and that's a licensed treatment facility.
Yeah. And I guess to summarize is really, it's not so much the property of the soil or the test results, is what activity was on that site before that triggers this.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It could be completely clean, has like even AL maybe.
Yeah, you could. it could have a certificate of compliance saying that it was cleaned up to meet agricultural standards, and you would still get caught up in this system because there was a Schedule 2 use and there's no exemptions for sites having been cleaned up. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's the confusion. I was confused about that at the beginning too.
Right.
We will have significant excess clean soil as we develop and excavate new landfill cells. Is it cost effective to run under the Mines Act as an alternative for soil relocation?
I guess it depends on how much it costs to get a Mines Act permit. I'm not that familiar with that process, frankly, so I don't know what that involves. We can see the costs of what soil relocation is based on, the level of assessment required. So this one I think would take a longer conversation to answer and dig into. It depends on is that landfill, is it already a landfill? Is it starting as a green field and there's no previous Schedule 2 use? I'd be happy to connect with Cole on that another time if he wants to reach out. The next one, better define a particular had Schedule 2 use, presuming one could subdivide this area and thus only have to test the applicable area. I see what you're saying. However, even if you've got a Schedule 2 use site and you apply for a subdivision permit, that means you're now filing a site disclosure statement. That SDS is going to identify a Schedule 2 use and it will be frozen. So you will not be allowed to subdivide your property until you go through the formal contaminated sites process. So, I don't see that being a realistic avenue to try and reduce your soil relocation commitments or requirements.
So if the next question is if it's moved within the same site. So
yeah, if it's your own site, then no, you're not required to file a notification. I will say that the rules for contaminated soil still apply. So if you know that is contaminated material, it cannot be put back in the ground once it's been excavated out of the ground. But yeah, if it's just clean soil and you just want to dig it up from one side of your site and place it on another, that's fine. No trigger here.
Okay. And does that apply to dredged material?
No, I don't think so, unless you would argue that the dredged material came from a Schedule 2 use site. So if you're dredging from a marina, for example, that's a Schedule 2 site, and yes, it would apply. If you're doing just dredging for river sand out of the Fraser, no, that's not a Schedule 2 use.
Okay, good point. Mines Act imposes significant additional. I think it's just a
comment. Yeah. So
that's for that other.
And so that's what I was saying. If it's a lot of work to get a Mines Act permit, it's probably not worth it. Just do your sampling and be done with it.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's all the questions.
Transfer station owned by the federal government exempt? I would say yes, that's a federal property. So if you're sending soil to a federal property, it's exempt from the notification process.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much. Thanks for everybody. I see one last question. We have 1 minute. So we ask this question too, and then we'll wrap it up. If a Schedule 2 defined site was already pre-approved for RLLD designated site and excavated is 50% complete, what would the testing protocol be based on? Remaining soil.
Yeah, and this is actually a great question because one thing you notice, these regulations are live. This is all in effect right now. So if you are in the middle of a dig, technically if you have not filed a notification, you should be stopping shipping your soil because you're not following the regulation as it is. There is no grandfathering period allowed by the ministry under this, unfortunately. So in this case, I would say, yes, you're assessing the 50% remaining. You'd only be responsible for looking at the soil that still has to be shipped. So that's the answer there. And then who is responsible? This kind of goes back to what we were talking about, Mana. I think at the end of the day, most responsibility rests with the site owner unless they have delegated that to additional parties. However, if the ministry wanted to fine someone, they would absolutely fine the site owner, without a doubt. And then the site owner could try and sue their contractor through their contractual agreements, I think. But at the end of the day, the site owner is going to have the overall responsibility to make sure everything was handled properly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So I see that Hwayda has added in chat our contacts to how to get a hold of us, Hwayda, Travis, and myself. And if you have any further question, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. And I have a comment from Stefan that's thanking Travis, that it's been very great. And thank you so much for all your help us navigate this.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, no problem. We're all in this together. We're all trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Okay, if you don't have any further comments, we can just wrap this up.
All right.
And,
sounds good.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And if you haven't signed up for Phil Connect, please do so and find place for your excavated material that is easier than all this process if it's clean. And to reach out to Hwayda if you need any help with your marketing and other issues. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.